I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about another abomination of the federal government. Bear in mind, the federal government was created in the Constitution. The Constitution is a contract between the citizens and the states. Prior to the existence of the Constitution in 1789, there was no federal government. There was a treaty between the states called the Articles of Confederation, but it was not a government. And it didn't pretend. There was no pretense that central government had any power over citizens or their businesses. And one of the things they wanted to do in the Constitution was create a central government that would foster businesses, that would not in any way harm businesses, and that would maximize the liberty of the people, minimize the amount of government there was. Because every time there's a law giving the central government power, that power comes from someplace. It comes from us. It's a zero-sum game. We lose power the more power we give the federal government. And it's unable to use, when it's dealing with us, when it's dealing with things that it's not supposed to do, it does it incompetently. It's no good at it. The one thing it's good at doing is what all governments can do, which is to impose the threat of harm for violating things. That's what the government does. It's its only power. The power to do harm. And it's supposed to do it in a just manner. But the federal government is supposed to have a very limited role in even doing the harm that we want. There are certain things we want harm done, like enforcing criminal laws. But that's not the responsibility of the federal government. The federal government is only allowed to enforce three crimes. The common law crime, to the extent that the federal government gets involved, federal government is allowed to enforce common law crimes that involve the federal government, like treason. Treason was a common law crime, but Article 3 of the Constitution limits the definition of treason. It requires 2 witnesses. So it's very hard for the federal government to need to be involved. And that's why there was no Justice Department until 1870. We didn't need it. There was a lawyer, basically, for the president, the Attorney General, and he was part of the cabinet. But he didn't preside over an agency that was involved in prosecuting citizens. Every time a prosecution takes place, that is harming a citizen. And in most cases, in virtually all cases where the federal government's involved in prosecuting people, it's not a real crime. It is not a crime involved in the things like murder, burglary. Those are real crimes. Those are the crimes that the states are supposed to enforce. What the federal government is supposed to enforce, the only crimes, they're actually described in the Constitution. And it's piracy, but only on the high seas. That doesn't happen much anymore. It was a big deal when the nation was founded. And counterfeiting. Those are the 2 crimes, other than enforcing common law treason to the extent it arises. But it was for example, Aaron Burr committed treason under the common law, no question. And they held a trial for him. He conspired with Mexico and Spain to take half the country. And this was a serious threat. This was in 1806. The country was pretty weak then. We had a limited military. General Wilkinson, who was basically the head general of the military, to the extent that we didn't have a standing army. They didn't want standing armies in those days. We basically had the ability to call on commercial boats, some of which had cannons on them, to basically a merchant marine. And that was largely what, of course, if a war came, then there would be a call-up of some kind. But we didn't have a standing army. It wasn't like that. And of course, we were protected in those days. It really mattered that we were oceans away from all our potential enemies. Anyway, the federal government has been doing all sorts of things it's not supposed to do. I was describing what the federal government is because I'm getting to the point. The point of this is to talk about the federal government and its land ownership. It's really disgusting. It was never contemplated that the federal government would own large parts of land. And in fact, the amount of land it owns is staggering. It's 28% of the real estate. There are states where the federal government owns more than half the land. In Alaska, it owns 60%. In Nevada, it's 80%. And this is not something the federal government should be doing. And what it does, the idea of having all this land ownership, well, what happened was during the 19th century, the country was acquiring a great deal of real estate. Thomas Jefferson, as president, purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon, and for $15 million. That's a hell of a deal. Napoleon was really desperate for cash, and as you know, things did not end well for him, if you're familiar with the story of Napoleon. Anyway, it was a huge part of the country. If you look at a map, it was basically half the country at that time. And when he bought that, the idea was to add that to the country, and ultimately for people to end up owning the real estate. It wasn't contemplated the federal government was going to own all that. And in fact, that's not really land that the federal government owns. It owns some land in virtually every state. Mostly it's things like post offices, various, and of course there are military bases. But in most states, it's not necessarily huge, although altogether it's 28% of the United States. That is a massive amount of real estate of enormous value. And bear in mind, our national debt now is $37 trillion. That's several times, and in fact, the debt is much higher than that, because that's just the way they do the accounting for our debt. Is really, they would get, if it was done for a private company the same way, they'd be put in jail for accounting fraud, because they don't count the biggest liabilities we have. They would call them off-balance sheet. Well, they're not off-balance sheet. They're real liabilities. And the big liabilities we have, the big debt, is the present value of the obligation to pay things like Social Security. Government's taken on all these responsibilities to pay this stuff. Welfare, but the big one is Social Security and Medicare. Those are going to, it's such a huge amount. It's many multiples of that 37 trillion. So that's the real debt, and it has to be counted because it is a real obligation, and the federal government's going to pay it. It never had any reason to do it other than politicians giving away future citizens money. That's what they do whenever they set up one of these programs where they're giving money away. It's not their money. They don't have any real money to give away. It's money that is taken from future citizens. And the one thing we have that could actually pay off that debt, first of all, we have to stop spending. And that debt is very dangerous, having a debt of that magnitude. It's bigger than our gross national product. And by the way, the gross national product is just, it's an accounting construct. It includes various things. One of the things it includes, it pretends that when the government spends money, dollar for dollar, the gross national product increases. So it's a notional construct. It doesn't really tell you what the economy is doing, except to the extent that you compare it from year to year. But that 37 trillion is several multiples of the actual size of our economy, however you calculate it. And the only way we're going to be able to really pay that off is to denationalize all that land. There's no reason for the federal government to be owning land. It's a terrible idea. And by the way, it really started the notion of the federal government keeping land to protect it. That's the idea they have. It's part of this whole nonsense of what they call environmentalism. What environmentalism really is, it's the claim that there is this moral demand to take people's property away. That's what environmentalism is. It's that the country has the right to tell people how to run their own property, because if they don't, it's going to hurt the environment. It's a nonsense idea. And this has been promoted. It began with things like conservationism. Like Teddy Roosevelt was the first one to have national parks. And by the way, these national parks are run terribly. All the fires that take place in the country all start on either federal or state-owned land because it's incompetently managed. In this country, there are millions and millions of acres of forests that are owned by private citizens where they raise lumber of various kinds. There's never a fire in those places. That's not where the fires ever start, and it's not where they end either. Those people know how to run a forest. But the federal government, it's got all sorts of political ideas that affect how they run the forest, including crazy ideas about environmentalism. And they get these ideas from crazy people, and it gets imposed as policy on all the rest of us. And all those fires that happen in California all start on public lands. because of the incompetent management. All those lands should be sold and let private people manage their own property. There's an idea called the tragedy of the commons, where when things are commonly owned, rather than being protected, they get run down. It's what happens because it's like nobody ever washes a used car. When nobody owns it, it falls apart. By the way, this was a lesson that the Pilgrims learned. The Pilgrims, when they first came to Massachusetts in 1642, they had an agreement among themselves. Basically, it was a communist agreement where they were going to share all the profits. And what happened was they nearly starved to death when they kept that idea. That was socialism. That's what it is when the government takes property in its own name and it uses things like environment. We have to protect the environment. That's the health of nature. It's always for health or safety. These are the pretexts that the government uses to take power away from us, or some emergency. It's like in the COVID thing, when the government said, oh, we have to shut down the whole country. That was an incredibly destructive and unconstitutional action. It's incredible that President Trump went along with that. But he got talked into it by Fauci and Birx. But that was an outrageous thing. But we have all this land that should not be owned by the federal government at all. Not at all. There's no, and the reason we have a lot of land owned by the federal government, like in Washington, D.C., we have all these buildings. What do you think is in those buildings? It's bureaucrats and bureaucracies that are unconstitutional. None of those bureaucracies should exist. And the Supreme Court is getting very close to admitting that's the case. It's had several rulings that are bit by bit stripping away all of those powers that those agencies had. There was one last year, or in 2024, 2025 is about to end. In 2024, the SEC v. Jarkesy, this involved a case where the SEC came after this guy. This is what they do, claiming that he had violated some stupid rule they had, and the SEC's view, they could either take him to a real court, what's called an Article 3 court, one of the federal district courts, or they could take him to their own court. They had their own courts, and guess how often they lost in their courts? 1% of the time. It was an absolute kangaroo court. The judges worked for the SEC. The prosecutors worked for the SEC. Everybody in that room, other than the poor guy who's getting harmed by the SEC, is on the payroll of the SEC. So what's the chance that the SEC is going to lose in their own court? Well, the Supreme Court ruled they can't do that. They cannot impose penalties on anybody, except in a real court. There has to be due process. That was a huge blow to those agencies, because what these agencies do is they exercise on an ongoing basis what amounts to judicial power. Even when it's not in those courts, they are imposing orders on citizens. Only courts are allowed to impose orders on citizens under a republic. In a republic, it's just the courts, and we're guaranteed a Republican form of government in the Constitution. That's one of the most important clauses. James Madison wanted that in there, and it's very important. And it's not just many people have read it, that it's only the states that have to have a guarantee clause. What it is, the federal government is guaranteeing that the states, that it will police the states to make sure that they have a Republican form of government. And because the Constitution is a contract between the people and the states, it's the states surrendering the power to not have a Republican form of government. They have to. And Madison wrote a whole essay about it in the Federalist, in which he said, basically, if the states have a government like what they had at that time, that would be good enough. That would constitute a Republican form of government. But it's not just the states that are supposed to have a Republican form of government. It's the federal government also. Because above all else, how can it enforce a Republican form of government for everyone else if it doesn't have one? And the Republican form of government has several attributes. One is that the people have to elect everyone who has any public office. They either elect them, or those elected people have to appoint people. That's the only way people can have power over the citizens. And one of the things about these bureaucracies, the whole bureaucracy exercises power over citizens. It does it against businesses. They take away the right of businesses to run their own business. There are certain parts of the economy that are particularly oppressed by these things. And those are the parts that have had the biggest problems, of course, like the entire financial services business. The way companies are set up to provide financial services to us is purely a function of their having to deal with these agencies. It's not the way it was prior to. The Fed was the first one that was set up in 1913. The Fed was created totally unconstitutional. I've done several videos about it, and I show that what the Fed does is it prints all the money. And it is one interesting thing. The only reason that paper money that we have that the Fed prints has any value at all is because it happens under our laws. It's the only legal tender. And because the economy itself has value, that money reflects the value of the economy in total. So that the amount of money in circulation, and basically it would be M2, as they call it. But the amount of money that we have is a reflection of the value of the economy and of our land. But the land itself is basically worthless in federal hands. It costs us money. It's not an asset. It's a liability of the federal government. And what do they do with that land? They keep us out. They literally have military-type protection for the land. If you go to a national park, there are places you're allowed to go, but you're not allowed to go to most of it. You are barred from going to most of it. And that's what they do. They think that they're protecting the land for nature and for the future. It's absolute nonsense. And that land could be better protected if it was sold to private people who takes care of their land better than someone who bought it and owns it or inherited it. And by the way, we have ways, things like the Grand Canyon, where you don't want people putting up eyesores. There are easements that the land could be sold subject. It could be sold, it's called a scenic easement, so that people could put up houses there, as long as they didn't ruin the view, if you want to put it that way. That's all that really matters. But those lands are a liability in the federal government's hands. If they were sold, then there would be a huge amount of money that would come in and to pay off our debt. It's really the only way it's going to get paid off. I think ultimately it's the only way that there's any credibility in the currency, because the economy obviously is the greatest economy in the world. And the stronger the economy, the more value the dollar can have. But the dollar has been falling really overall. That's what inflation is. Inflation is a decline in the value. And what it is, because the Fed has violated the Constitution by existing. The greatest crime that they wanted prosecuted, one of the 3 crimes that are prosecutable by the federal government for real in the Constitution: piracy and counterfeiting. The Fed is counterfeiting every dollar it makes, every dollar, because they're not backed by gold. And at the time the Republic was formed, only gold-backed currency was permitted. In fact, in Article 1, Section 10, it forbids the use of anything except silver and gold to pay debts. So what good is paper money? Well, the paper money has value because of its scarcity, actually. They don't have an unlimited ability to print it. Unfortunately, though, they don't pay much attention to that, because whenever a liability comes up that has to be paid, they print it. And the more they print, the lower the value. And during the Biden administration, we had inflation. It was a minimum of 20% over those 4 years. And arguably it was as high as 30 or 40%. There's different ways of calculating inflation. Anyway, it was extremely high. But since the time the Fed was formed in 1913, as of 2020, before the Biden inflation started, the dollar was worth 1/23 of what it had been worth in 1913. And prior to 1913, the way the currency was done, and it was a national currency, the dollar, it was printed by banks. It was all private. There was no Fed. And when the first Bank of the United States was created, I've done a whole video about that, where I talked about the first bank. It was not anything like the Fed. It was just a bank. where the charter happened to be issued by the federal government instead of by the states, and 20% of the stock was owned by the federal government. But it wasn't. It was not supposed to do anything with the other banks. Now, in fact, it became a bully. It really did, and so they did. And then it had a charter limiting how long it could exist. And when the charter expired, a lot of people didn't want it. It happens that James Madison, who had been very much opposed to it, because he agreed with Jefferson that it was completely unconstitutional. Jefferson and Hamilton wrote memos to Washington about the constitutionality of it. And Hamilton said it was barely constitutional, but not under the Interstate Commerce Clause, which is what they used to justify the constitutionality of every single one of these agencies, including the environmental ones. But anyway, the Fed has been a disaster, and this land ownership is monstrous. The land costs us taxpayers money to run. Now, if it was owned by private people, it would be an asset. They would pay for it, and the liability would be released from the federal government. It wouldn't have to worry about managing it, and the amount of mineral wealth that we have would be unlocked. There wouldn't be this stupid federal loan and all these federal environmental things that miners or oil and gas drillers have to go through. None of that stuff has any legitimacy under the Constitution. They should never have to do it. And these environmental groups that sue them, it's none of their damn business. They don't own any land there. They don't get to complain about what the real landowner wants to do with his land. If he wants to put in a mine, as long as it's not a nuisance to his neighbors, because under the common law, you can't just do things with your land that harm other people. There's two types of nuisance under the common law, and people can sue you for this. They can even get injunctions to prevent you from creating a nuisance, if that's what you're going to do. So we've got enough control over landowners and what they do with their land under the common law. We don't need any of this environmental stuff, and most of it is just cynical stuff to prevent people from using their land, because that's what environmentalism is really all about. It's promoting nature over the rights and the benefits to human beings. That's what it really is. It's the choice that this thing called nature is more important. They don't believe in God, but they think nature is more important than real land, and they want to stop people who own their land from using it. That's also what zoning laws do. Zoning laws are enforced at the local level, where they prevent people from improving their own property unless they jump through all these hoops. In theory, it increases the value of existing properties because it limits the supply of houses. In California, you can't find a house for less than millions of dollars. And that's because they have incredible zoning laws. The builders can't build them without jumping through all these hoops and paying all sorts of stuff. And it takes years. They buy the land, and by the time they can actually do anything with it, it's years later. That's another form of government functional ownership of land. The government doesn't have the right to own all this land. It has to divest itself of it. Under the common law, we had fee simple ownership, fee simple absolute ownership. This goes back to Magna Carta, when the nobles got King John to sign Magna Carta. The major thing they had was the right to private property, to really own their property, so that no one could invade it. Their castle really was their castle. And your home, if you own it, is supposed to be your castle. And if you rent it, you're renting the right to have your own castle. That's what's landowner. And the more power of the rights of landowners, the wealthier the country, because that's what makes people rich, when their property is worth more to own. That's a form of wealth. And when the government comes in and takes your rights over the property away, it strips you of the value of that property. And when it does it in mass, like when the government owns all that land and prevents citizens from even enjoying it, even as a park. And it's fine for there to be state parks in various places, but the idea of the government owning 80% of Nevada, Nevada, that's what it owns. And it owns 60% of several other states, over 50% of multiple states, mostly in the West. Idaho, I think it owns 80% or 60%. And, this is beautiful land. It could be sold to people to put up homes, and the government would get the wealth to pay off the debt that comes from the sale of that, and it would no longer be a government liability. It would add to our overall freedom as citizens, which is the most important thing the government could do. It needs to sell all that land that it owns, and it can sell it subject to scenic easements so that we don't lose the beauty. But rest assured, no one takes better care of land than the landowner, and that we have more than enough ability to make sure the landowner doesn't harm anyone else's property under public and private nuisance torts, which is what they are, so that the person who's actually harmed, if there's a person whose land is actually harmed by the nuisance, he gets to sue the landowner who does that. That's the way it works under the common law. It's not just the government for preventing you from doing things. It's people who are actually harmed come in, and if no one is harmed, you don't get sued. It's that simple. I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you like this video, and I hope you go to my YouTube channel and my website, cliffordribner.com, and I hope you read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.